The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of the grand estate as Marcus adjusted his uniform for what he thought would be another ordinary day. At 28, he had been working as a security guard for the wealthy Beaumont family for nearly 3 years. The pay was decent, the work mostly routine, and the family treated their staff with respect. Marcus had no reason to believe that this particular Tuesday would become the day that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Beaumont estate sprawled across 40 acres of pristine countryside, complete with manicured gardens, a tennis court, and a swimming pool that sparkled like a jewel in the morning light. But the crown jewel of the property was Louis Beaumont's wine cellar, a temperature-controlled sanctuary that housed one of the most impressive private collections in the region. Bottles worth thousands of dollars lined the walls, some dating back decades, carefully curated by Louis himself over 20 years of passionate collecting. Marcus had always found Louis to be an interesting character. Unlike many wealthy people he had encountered, Louis was genuinely passionate about his wines. He would spend hours in that cellar, carefully examining bottles, making notes in his leather-bound journal, and planning which wines to serve at various family gatherings. The cellar wasn't just a status symbol for Louis, it was his personal retreat, his sanctuary from the pressures of running a successful business empire. On this particular morning, Marcus noticed something different in the air. There was a tension that seemed to permeate the entire household. The usual cheerful chatter among the staff was replaced by hushed conversations and worried glances. Mrs. Helena Beaumont, Louis's wife of 30 years, had been pacing the main hallway since early morning, her heels clicking anxiously against the marble floor. Their daughter Sarah, home from university for the weekend, kept checking her phone with an expression of growing concern. The source of the family's distress became clear when Marcus overheard a heated phone conversation between Louis and his business partner, David Richardson. The two men had built their construction company from the ground up, transforming it from a small local business into a major player in commercial development. But success had come with its own set of challenges, and recent months had been particularly difficult. From what Marcus could gather from the fragments of conversation he overheard, there were serious financial irregularities in the company's accounts. David had been making questionable decisions, approving projects without proper consultation, and there were suspicions about missing funds. The partnership that had once been built on trust and mutual respect was crumbling, and Louis was devastated by what he saw as a betrayal by his closest friend and business partner. As the day progressed, the tension in the house continued to build. Marcus went about his regular duties, checking the perimeter, monitoring the security cameras, and ensuring that all access points were properly secured. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. The other staff members seemed to sense it too. Maria, the housekeeper who had worked for the family for over a decade, kept glancing toward Louis's study with obvious concern. James, the groundskeeper, worked with unusual intensity, as if physical labor could somehow ward off the trouble that seemed to be gathering like storm clouds. Around midday, David Richardson arrived at the estate. Marcus had met him several times before and had always found him to be charming and well-dressed, the kind of man who commanded respect in business circles. But today, David looked different. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, his face was pale, and there was something desperate in his eyes that made Marcus instinctively wary. The meeting between the two partners took place in Louis's study, behind closed doors. But the sound of raised voices carried through the house, and it was clear that the conversation was not going well. Marcus positioned himself strategically in the hallway, ostensibly checking the security panel but actually trying to assess the situation. His training had taught him to be alert to potential conflicts, and every instinct he possessed was telling him that this situation was volatile. After about an hour, David emerged from the study, his face flushed with anger. He stormed through the house without acknowledging any of the staff, his footsteps echoing aggressively against the floors. Marcus heard a car door slam and the screech of tires as David left the property at dangerous speed. The house fell into an eerie silence that felt more oppressive than the earlier tension. Louis remained in his study for the rest of the afternoon, and, when he finally emerged for dinner, he looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single day. His usually confident demeanor was replaced by a heavy sadness, and he barely touched the meal that Maria had carefully prepared. Helena sat beside him, offering quiet support, but even she seemed at a loss for how to comfort her husband. After dinner, Lewis made an announcement that surprised everyone. He told the family and staff that he would be spending the evening in his wine cellar, going through his collection and making some important decisions about the future. He asked not to be disturbed, saying he needed time to think and plan his next steps. It wasn't unusual for Lewis to retreat to his cellar when he was troubled, but something about his manner suggested that this night would be different. As evening approached, Marcus began his regular security rounds. The estate felt different in the darkness, more isolated and vulnerable. The usual sounds of the countryside seemed muted, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Marcus checked each door, window, and gate with extra care, paying particular attention to the cellar entrance. Lewis had indeed gone down to his sanctuary, and a warm light glowed from beneath the heavy wooden door. Around 10 o'clock, Marcus received an unexpected phone call. It was David Richardson, and he sounded different from earlier. The anger was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like panic. David explained that he needed to speak with Lewis urgently, that there were things he needed to explain and apologies he needed to make. He was driving back to the estate and would arrive within 30 minutes. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Something about David's tone set off alarm bells in his mind. He had worked security long enough to develop good instincts about people and situations, and every fiber of his being was telling him that David's return could spell trouble. But what could he do? David was still technically Lewis's business partner and had every right to visit the estate. After ending the call, Marcus immediately went to inform Lewis of David's impending arrival. He knocked on the cellar door and called out, but received no response. He could hear movement inside, the soft clink of bottles and the rustle of papers, but Lewis didn't acknowledge his calls. Marcus assumed that his employer was too absorbed in his thoughts and activities to hear him clearly. 25 minutes later, Marcus saw David's car approaching through the security cameras. But something was wrong with this picture. David was driving erratically, weaving slightly on the private road that led to the house. When he parked and got out of the car, Marcus could see that his earlier desperation had transformed into something more dangerous. David moved with the jerky, unpredictable motions of someone who was either intoxicated or in the grip of extreme emotional distress. Marcus made a decision that would later prove to be crucial. Instead of allowing David immediate access to the house as he normally would, he decided to intercept him at the main entrance. Something told him that David and Lewis should not meet face-to-face in their current emotional states, at least not without some kind of mediation or supervision. When David reached the door, Marcus greeted him with professional courtesy but made it clear that he would need to wait while Lewis was contacted. David's reaction was immediate and explosive. He demanded to be let in immediately, claiming that he had urgent business matters to discuss that couldn't wait. His voice was loud and aggressive, and Marcus could smell alcohol on his breath. The confrontation escalated quickly. David began pushing against Marcus, trying to force his way into the house. Marcus, trained in conflict de-escalation, tried to calm the situation while maintaining his position. But David was beyond reason, shouting about betrayal and revenge, making threats that chilled Marcus to the bone. It became clear that David was not in a rational state of mind and posed a potential danger to the Beaumont family. Marcus made the decision that would define the rest of the evening. He firmly but politely informed David that he would not be allowed into the house in his current condition. He suggested that David go home, sober up, and return the next day when he could have a civilized conversation with Lewis. David's response was to become even more aggressive, pushing harder against Marcus and making increasingly violent threats. The situation reached a breaking point when David pulled out his phone and began making calls to unknown numbers, speaking in angry, hushed tones about teaching Lewis a lesson he would never forget. Marcus realized that this was no longer just about a business dispute between partners. David was planning something, and, whatever it was, it posed a serious threat to the safety of everyone in the house. At that moment, Marcus made the decision that would change everything. He activated the estate's lockdown protocol, a security measure that sealed all entrances and exits and automatically alerted the local police. The system had been installed years earlier but had never been used. As the heavy locks engaged throughout the property, including the wine cellar door where Lewis remained unaware of the drama unfolding above, Marcus realized that he had just disobeyed the most fundamental rule of his employment: never lock the family inside their own home. But, as David's threats grew more specific and more violent, Marcus knew that he had made the right choice. The wine cellar door, now electronically locked as part of the security protocol, stood between Lewis and whatever David had planned. Marcus had defied his orders to provide unrestricted access to family, friends, and business associates, but, in doing so, he may have saved his employer's life. The night was far from over, and Marcus had no idea just how much chaos his decision would unleash. But, as he stood guard at the sealed entrance, listening to David's increasingly frantic attempts to gain entry, he knew that there would be no turning back. The wine cellar door that had always represented Lewis's sanctuary had now become his fortress, and Marcus was the guardian who had chosen protection over protocol. The electronic hum of the lockdown system filled the estate with an ominous mechanical symphony that Marcus had never heard before. Red lights blinked steadily throughout the property, indicating that the security protocol was fully engaged. Every door, every window, every possible entry point was now sealed with reinforced locks that could only be disengaged from the main security control room. Marcus stood at his post, watching David pace frantically outside the main entrance like a caged animal, his earlier desperation now transformed into barely controlled rage. Inside the house, the Beaumont family was beginning to realize that something extraordinary was happening. Helena had been reading in the living room when she heard the distinctive sound of the locks engaging. She immediately called out for her husband, but received no response. Sarah emerged from her bedroom, her face pale with confusion and growing fear. The two women found each other in the main hallway, both instinctively understanding that their comfortable, secure world had suddenly become something very different. Marcus tried to maintain his composure as he explained the situation to the family through the intercom system. He told them about David's erratic behavior, his threats, and the decision to activate the lockdown protocol for their protection. But, even as he spoke, Marcus could hear the inadequacy of his words. How could he explain that he had essentially made them prisoners in their own home? How could he justify sealing Lewis in the wine cellar, cut off from his family during what was clearly a crisis? Helena's initial reaction was one of grateful relief. She had sensed David's increasing instability over the past few months and had even expressed her concerns to Lewis on several occasions. The idea that David might pose a physical threat to her family was terrifying but not entirely surprising. She trusted Marcus's judgment and supported his decision to prioritize their safety over social conventions. Sarah, however, was less understanding. As a young woman who had grown up with privilege and security, the concept of being locked inside her own home was both alien and frightening. She demanded that Marcus unlock the doors immediately, insisting that they could handle David themselves. Her youth and inexperience with genuine danger made it difficult for her to appreciate the gravity of the situation. But Marcus's attention was divided between calming the family and monitoring David's increasingly erratic behavior outside. Through the security cameras, he could see that David had returned to his car and was making phone calls. The conversations appeared heated and urgent, and Marcus noticed that David kept gesturing toward the house in an aggressive manner. Whatever David was planning, he was apparently not planning to do it alone. The wine cellar, meanwhile, had become an unintentional fortress. The heavy wooden door that Lewis had always valued for its ability to maintain the perfect temperature and humidity for his collection now served as an impenetrable barrier. The electronic lock, engaged as part of the security protocol, was designed to withstand significant force. Lewis, unaware of the drama unfolding above, continued his evening among his beloved bottles, completely isolated from the outside world. Marcus attempted to contact Lewis through the cellar's intercom system, but discovered that the lockdown protocol had disabled all internal communications as well. The system had been designed to create a complete seal, preventing any potential intruders from using the house's own communication systems to coordinate an attack. But this meant that Lewis was now completely cut off from his family and staff, with no way to know what was happening or to communicate his own situation. Outside, David's behavior was becoming increasingly concerning. Marcus watched through the cameras as more cars arrived at the estate. 3 men emerged from the vehicles, and even from a distance, Marcus could tell that these were not business associates or friends. They moved with the purposeful, coordinated manner of people who were used to violence. David greeted them with animated gestures, pointing toward the house and clearly explaining some kind of plan. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. This was not just about a business dispute or hurt feelings between former partners. David had apparently planned some kind of coordinated attack on the Beaumont family, and Marcus's decision to activate the lockdown had interrupted whatever scheme was supposed to unfold. The wine cellar door that now stood locked was not just protecting Louis from an uncomfortable confrontation, it was potentially saving his life. Helena and Sarah had moved to the main living room, where they could observe the driveway through the large windows. When they saw the additional men arrive, Helena's face went white with fear. She immediately understood that this situation was far more serious than a simple business disagreement. Sarah, finally, grasping the reality of their danger, stopped demanding that Marcus unlock the doors and instead asked what they should do to stay safe. Marcus realized that he needed to take charge of the situation completely. His training had prepared him for various security scenarios, but nothing quite like this. He instructed Helena and Sarah to move to the interior rooms of the house, away from windows and external walls. He activated the estate's emergency communication system, which would send alerts to the local police, the security company, and several emergency contacts that Louis had designated. The response was swift but not swift enough. Marcus received confirmation that police units were being dispatched to the estate, but the remote location meant that it would be at least 20 minutes before help arrived. 20 minutes might as well be 20 hours when facing determined attackers who clearly had some kind of plan. Through the security monitors, Marcus watched as David and his companions began a systematic examination of the property. They tested doors and windows, looking for weak points in the lockdown system. David appeared to have some knowledge of the estate's layout and security features, which made sense given his frequent visits over the years as Louis's business partner. This inside knowledge made him particularly dangerous. The men split into groups, with one pair moving toward the back of the house while David and another man focused on the main entrance. Marcus realized that they were probing the security system, looking for vulnerabilities that they could exploit. The lockdown protocol was designed to be comprehensive, but no system was perfect, especially when facing attackers who had time and knowledge on their side. Inside the wine cellar, Louis remained blissfully unaware of the danger swirling around him. Marcus could see through the cellar's internal security camera that Louis was moving systematically through his collection, examining bottles and making notes in his journal. Occasionally, Louis would pause to taste a wine, savoring the complexity of flavors that had developed over years of careful aging. The peaceful scene was almost surreal given the chaos erupting throughout the rest of the estate. Marcus made several attempts to communicate with the police dispatcher, providing updates on the number of attackers and their apparent coordination. The dispatcher assured him that multiple units were en route and advised him to maintain the lockdown and avoid any direct confrontation. But Marcus could see that David's group was becoming more aggressive in their attempts to breach the security system. One of the men had produced what appeared to be professional lockpicking tools and was working on a service entrance at the side of the house. Another was examining the electrical system, apparently looking for ways to disable the power that maintained the lockdown. David himself had returned to his car and was retrieving items from the trunk, including what looked like crowbars and other tools that could be used to force entry. The situation reached a new level of urgency when Marcus noticed that the man working on the electrical system had managed to locate the main power junction box. If they could cut the power to the house, the electronic locks would revert to manual operation, and the lockdown would be compromised. Marcus realized that he needed to make another difficult decision. Helena and Sarah had taken shelter in the interior study, following Marcus's instructions to stay away from external walls and windows. But Marcus knew that if the attackers gained entry to the house, there would be nowhere for the family to hide. The estate was large but not infinite, and determined intruders would eventually find them. The wine cellar, ironically, was probably the safest place in the entire property, but Louis was trapped there alone while his family remained exposed. Marcus made a desperate calculation. The police were still at least 10 minutes away, and David's group was making steady progress in their attempts to breach the security system. The man at the electrical box had removed the cover and was studying the wiring with obvious expertise. Within minutes, they might succeed in cutting the power and gaining access to the house. The decision that Marcus made next would later be debated by security experts and legal professionals. Against all his training and the direct instructions from the police dispatcher, he decided to leave his secure position in the control room and attempt to reach the wine cellar. His reasoning was that if the attackers succeeded in entering the house, Lewis would be trapped in the cellar with no way to defend himself or even know that danger was approaching. But reaching the cellar meant crossing the main hallway and descending a staircase that would leave him exposed to anyone who might breach the perimeter. It also meant leaving Helena and Sarah without his direct protection, relying instead on the hope that the remaining security measures would hold until the police arrived. As Marcus prepared to make his dangerous journey through the house, he could hear the sound of metal tools working against the service door. The rhythmic scraping and prying sounds suggested that David's group was making progress in their attempts to force entry. Time was running out, and Marcus knew that every second of delay could prove fatal for the entire Beaumont family. The wine cellar door remained steadfastly locked, its electronic mechanism humming quietly as it maintained its protective seal. Inside, Lewis continued his methodical examination of his collection, completely unaware that his life might depend on the very door he had always used to shut out the world. The sanctuary that had always provided him with peace and solitude had now become his fortress, but it was a fortress under siege. Marcus took a deep breath, checked his equipment one final time, and prepared to abandon his secure position. The next few minutes would determine whether his decision to disobey orders and activate the lockdown would save the Beaumont family or simply delay their fate. The wine cellar door stood as the last barrier between Lewis and whatever David had planned, but even the strongest barriers could not hold forever against determined attackers with time and tools. The moment Marcus stepped out of the security control room, the house seemed to transform around him. The familiar hallways and rooms that he had patrolled countless times now felt alien and threatening. Every shadow could conceal danger, every sound could signal the breach he knew was coming. The red emergency lights cast everything in an apocalyptic glow, turning the elegant Beaumont home into something resembling a scene from a nightmare. Marcus moved quickly but carefully toward the wine cellar, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting that Helena had chosen for both comfort and sound dampening. The irony was not lost on him that the very feature designed to create a peaceful home environment was now helping him move undetected through his own defensive position. Behind him, he could hear Helena and Sarah speaking in hushed, frightened tones from their hiding place in the interior study. The sound of splintering would suddenly echo through the house, followed by a triumphant shout from outside. Marcus froze, his heart pounding as he realized that David's group had successfully breached one of the entry points. The service door that had been under attack had finally given way to their persistent efforts. The lockdown system had been compromised, and the estate was no longer a fortress but a trap. Heavy footsteps began moving through the house, and Marcus could hear multiple voices coordinating their search. David's voice was clearly audible among them, directing his companions with the confidence of someone who knew the layout intimately. They were not moving randomly, they had a plan, and that plan apparently involved finding and confronting Lewis before anyone could interfere. Marcus reached the top of the wine cellar stairs just as he heard David's group entering the main hallway. The timing was crucial. If he descended now, he would be trapped in the cellar with Lewis, but they would at least be together behind the locked door. If he stayed upstairs, he might be able to continue providing some protection for Helena and Sarah, but Lewis would remain isolated and vulnerable to whatever David had planned. The decision was made for him when he heard David shout Lewis's name with a mixture of rage and betrayal that chilled Marcus to the bone. "Where are you, Lewis? We need to have that conversation we started earlier, but this time, you're going to listen to everything I have to say." The threat in David's voice was unmistakable, and Marcus knew that this confrontation would not end with words. Marcus quickly descended the cellar stairs, taking them two at a time while trying to remain as quiet as possible. The wine cellar door stood before him, its electronic lock still engaged and humming softly. Through the thick wood, he could hear Lewis moving around inside, still apparently unaware of the danger that had invaded his home. The sound of bottles clinking together suggested that Lewis was continuing his evening routine, perhaps selecting wines for an upcoming dinner party or simply enjoying the therapeutic process of organizing his collection. The lock on the cellar door presented Marcus with another dilemma. The security protocol required his personal access code to override the lockdown, but using it would create an electronic record of his actions. If the situation went wrong, if people were hurt or killed, his decision to unlock the door could be seen as a critical failure in his security procedures. But if he left Lewis locked inside while attackers roamed the house, the consequences could be far worse. Marcus entered his override code and heard the electronic lock disengage with a soft click. He pushed open the heavy door and slipped inside the wine cellar, immediately closing and manually relocking it behind him. The cellar was dimly lit by soft LED strips that ran along the wine racks, creating a warm, intimate atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the chaos erupting throughout the rest of the house. Lewis looked up in surprise as Marcus entered. He was holding a bottle of 1982 Bordeaux, examining the label with the focused attention of a true connoisseur. His expression shifted from surprise to concern as he took in Marcus's obvious distress and the red emergency lighting that was now visible through the small window near the cellar's ceiling. "Marcus? What's happening up there? I've been hearing strange sounds, and these emergency lights." Lewis's voice trailed off as he began to understand that something serious was occurring. Marcus quickly explained the situation, describing David's erratic behavior, the arrival of his companions, and the decision to activate the lockdown protocol. As he spoke, Lewis's face went through a range of emotions: confusion, disbelief, fear, and, finally, a deep sadness that seemed to age him before Marcus's eyes. "David's really done it, hasn't he?" Lewis said quietly, setting down the wine bottle with trembling hands. "I kept hoping that our friendship meant something to him, that he would come to his senses and we could work through our business problems like civilized people. But if he's brought others here, if he's threatening my family..." Lewis's voice hardened with a resolve that Marcus had never heard before. Above them, the sounds of the search were getting closer. Marcus could hear furniture being moved, doors slamming open, and David's increasingly frustrated calls for Lewis to show himself. The voices were getting nearer to the cellar entrance, and Marcus realized that it would only be a matter of minutes before they discovered the wine cellar door. Lewis moved to a section of the cellar that Marcus had never noticed before. Behind a rack of vintage champagnes, there was a small safe built into the stone wall. Lewis quickly opened it and retrieved several items: important documents, some cash, and a pistol that he handled with obvious familiarity. "I've had this permit for years," Lewis explained, checking the weapon with practiced efficiency. "Helena insisted after that break in 3 neighborhoods over last winter. I never thought I'd actually need it, especially not for protecting myself from David." The bitter irony in his voice was unmistakable. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. His decision to disobey orders and activate the lockdown had led to this moment: a successful businessman hiding in his own wine cellar, armed and preparing to defend himself against someone who had once been his closest friend and business partner. The situation had escalated far beyond anything Marcus had anticipated when he first noticed David's erratic behavior that morning. The sound of footsteps on the cellar stairs made both men freeze. David had found the entrance to the wine cellar, and his voice carried clearly through the heavy door as he called out to his companions. "He's got to be down here. This is his favorite hiding place when he wants to sulk about business problems." Marcus positioned himself beside the door, preparing for what might be their last line of defense. Lewis stood further back in the cellar, among the wines he had collected over decades of passionate pursuit. The bottles that surrounded him represented years of careful selection, special occasions, and memories shared with family and friends. Now they might serve as his final sanctuary. David's voice came through the door, closer now and filled with a bitter mixture of anger and wounded friendship. "Lewis, I know you're in there. We can hear you moving around. Just open the door, and let's finish the conversation we started earlier. I've got some friends with me who are very interested in hearing your side of our business disagreement." The threat was clear, but so was the underlying pain in David's voice. This was not just about money or business deals gone wrong. This was about the destruction of a friendship that had once been the foundation of both men's professional lives. David felt betrayed, abandoned, and humiliated, and he was determined to make Lewis understand the depth of his pain, regardless of the consequences. Lewis stepped closer to the door but did not unlock it. David, I don't know who you've brought to my home, but this isn't the way to resolve our problems. Let my family go, send your friends away, and we can talk like the civilized men we used to be. David's response was immediate and filled with rage. Civilized? You want to talk about being civilized? Was it civilized when you accused me of stealing from our company? Was it civilized when you threatened to destroy my reputation and ruin my career? You've already made your choice, Lewis. Now you have to live with the consequences. The sound of metal tools against the door lock made Marcus's blood run cold. David's companions were apparently skilled in more than intimidation. They had come prepared to deal with locked doors and security systems. The electronic lock that had protected Lewis was being systematically dismantled by people who clearly had experience with such work. Marcus realized that they had perhaps minutes before the cellar door would be breached. The wine cellar, which had seemed like a fortress, was about to become a trap. Lewis stood among his precious collection, armed but outnumbered, facing the destruction of not just his business partnership but possibly his life. The bottles that surrounded them had witnessed decades of celebration and friendship, but now they might witness something far darker. The sound of the lock mechanism being defeated echoed through the cellar with a finality that made both men's hearts sink. The door that had protected Lewis's sanctuary for so many years was about to be opened by force, and whatever happened next would change all their lives forever. Marcus gripped his radio, hoping against hope that the police response would arrive in time, while Lewis held his weapon with the grim determination of a man who had run out of options. The wine cellar door, which had stood locked for what felt like hours but had actually been less than 30 minutes, was about to reveal its secrets. The sanctuary that had always provided Lewis with peace and solitude was about to become the setting for a confrontation that would determine whether the bonds of friendship and business could truly be broken by greed, betrayal, and violence. The cellar door swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through decades of friendship and trust. David stood silhouetted in the doorway, flanked by two men whose faces Marcus didn't recognize but whose posture and bearing suggested they were comfortable with violence. The warm, intimate lighting of the wine cellar created an almost theatrical atmosphere, as if this confrontation were taking place on a stage designed for tragedy. Lewis stood perfectly still among his wine collection, the pistol held at his side but clearly visible. His face showed a mixture of sadness, determination, and the kind of resigned courage that comes from understanding that a situation has moved beyond the point of peaceful resolution. The man who had spent so many pleasant evenings in this cellar, sharing fine wines with friends and family, now found himself preparing for what might be his last stand. David stepped into the cellar, his eyes immediately taking in the scene before him. The sight of Lewis with a weapon seemed to both surprise and infuriate him. Really, Lewis? You're going to threaten me with a gun? After everything we've been through together? After I made you rich beyond your wildest dreams? The pain in David's voice was genuine, but so was the anger that had been building throughout their long day of confrontation. This was not just about business anymore, it was about the death of a friendship that had once been the most important relationship in both men's lives. David had convinced himself that Lewis was the villain in their story, the ungrateful partner who had abandoned loyalty for the sake of righteousness. Marcus remained positioned beside the door, hoping to stay out of the line of fire while being ready to intervene if necessary. His radio crackled softly with updates from the police dispatcher, informing him that multiple units were now on the property and moving toward the house. But the basement location of the wine cellar meant that help was still several critical minutes away. I never threatened you with anything except the truth, Lewis replied, his voice steady despite the circumstances. The money that's missing from our accounts, the unauthorized contracts, the deals that were made without my knowledge or consent, those weren't threats, David. Those were facts that needed to be addressed. David's face contorted with rage at the mention of the business irregularities that had destroyed their partnership. Facts? You want to talk about facts? Here's a fact for you, I built that company as much as you did. I worked 18-hour days, I sacrificed my personal relationships, I gave you everything I had. And, the moment things got complicated, you turned on me like I was some kind of criminal. One of David's companions, a tall man with scarred hands and cold eyes, stepped forward impatiently. This is taking too long. We didn't come here for a therapy session. Just tell us where you keep the real financial records, and we can all go home. The interruption seemed to break something inside David. The pretense of this being about wounded friendship fell away, revealing the calculated nature of what was really happening. This was not just about confronting Lewis or demanding apologies, it was about forcing him to provide access to information that could be used to cover up or redistribute the missing money. Lewis's expression hardened as he realized the true nature of David's visit. "You're not here to talk about our partnership or to work through our differences. You're here to steal from me, just like you stole from our company. You brought these men to intimidate me into giving you access to my personal financial records." David's laugh was bitter and humorless. "Steal? Everything I took from that company was rightfully mine. I earned every dollar through years of hard work while you sat in your comfortable office making decisions based on principles you could afford because I was doing the dirty work that actually made us money." The conversation was revealing the deep-seated resentments that had been building between the partners for years. David felt unappreciated and underpaid, convinced that his contributions to their success had been minimized while Lewis received the credit and the respect. Lewis, on the other hand, had apparently been unaware of the extent of David's bitterness and felt betrayed by the deceptive practices that had been occurring under his nose. Marcus could hear movement upstairs, the sounds of police officers entering the house and beginning their search. But he also knew that the cellar's location and the ongoing confrontation made it dangerous for the officers to intervene immediately. Any sudden action could trigger violence that might result in multiple casualties. The second of David's companions, a shorter but more muscular man with tattoos visible on his forearms, began examining the wine collection with obvious interest. "Look at all this expensive stuff. This one bottle probably costs more than I make in a month." His tone suggested that the disparity between Lewis's wealth and his own circumstances was yet another justification for whatever they had planned. "Don't touch anything," Lewis said sharply, his protective instincts for his collection overriding his fear of the dangerous situation. The wines represented more than just monetary value, they were a lifetime of careful selection, special occasions, and memories that could never be replaced. David seized on Lewis's reaction with cruel satisfaction. "Still worried about your precious bottles? Still more concerned about your material possessions than about the people whose lives you've destroyed? This is exactly why our partnership had to end, Lewis. You never understood what really mattered." The psychological dynamics of the confrontation were becoming increasingly complex. David was using Lewis's love for his wine collection as evidence of his character flaws, while simultaneously planning to benefit from Lewis's wealth through intimidation and, possibly, theft. The wine cellar, which had always been Lewis's sanctuary from such ugly realities, was now the stage for the ugliest confrontation of his life. Marcus's radio crackled again with an update from the police team leader. They had secured the upper floors of the house and located Helena and Sarah, who were unharmed but terrified. The officers were now moving systematically through the house, following the sounds of voices that were carrying up from the basement level. "The police are already here," Marcus announced, hoping to defuse the situation before it escalated further. "David, you and your friends need to end this now, before someone gets hurt. This has gone way beyond a business dispute." David's response was to signal to his companions, who immediately moved to more threatening positions. The taller man stepped behind a wine rack that would provide cover if shooting started, while the shorter man moved closer to Lewis, clearly intending to use proximity as an intimidation tactic. "The police?" David laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Perfect. They can witness Lewis admitting to his theft and fraud. They can hear him confess to destroying the livelihoods of dozens of employees because of his self-righteous principles." The delusion in David's thinking was now fully apparent. He had convinced himself that he was the victim in their business relationship, and that whatever actions he took were justified by Lewis's alleged betrayals. The missing money, the unauthorized contracts, the intimidation, all of it was rationalized as appropriate responses to Lewis's supposed misconduct. Lewis seemed to understand that reasoning with David was impossible. Years of friendship and partnership had been poisoned by resentment and self-justification to the point where David could no longer see reality clearly. The man standing in the wine cellar was no longer the partner who had helped build their company from nothing. He was someone who had chosen a path that led inevitably to this moment of confrontation. "I'm sorry it came to this, David," Lewis said quietly. "I'm sorry our friendship meant so little to you that you would threaten my family and invade my home. I'm sorry you chose this path instead of working with me to solve our problems honestly." The apology seemed to enrage David even further. "Your friendship? Your home? Everything you have because of me. And now you want to destroy me because I made some decisions you didn't approve of? Well, Lewis, some decisions can't be taken back, and some friendships can't be repaired." The sound of heavy footsteps on the cellar stairs indicated that the police had located the wine cellar entrance. Marcus felt a mixture of relief and anxiety, knowing that the arrival of law enforcement would either resolve the situation peacefully or trigger the violence that everyone had been dreading. The wine cellar, filled with bottles that had witnessed so many celebrations and quiet moments of contemplation, was about to become the setting for the final act of a friendship that had turned into something dark and dangerous. The locked door that had protected Lewis's sanctuary was now open, but the real barriers, the walls of resentment, betrayal, and wounded pride, seemed higher and more impenetrable than ever. The first police officer to appear at the cellar entrance was Sergeant Patricia Hayes, a 20-year veteran who had responded to countless domestic disputes and business conflicts. But, as she took in the scene before her, 4 men in a wine cellar, 1 armed civilian, 2 obvious criminals, and a security guard caught in the middle, she immediately understood that this situation was unlike anything in her extensive experience. "Everyone needs to remain calm and keep their hands visible," Sergeant Hayes announced in the authoritative voice that had served her well throughout her career. Her partner, Officer James Morrison, positioned himself on the opposite side of the doorway, creating overlapping fields of observation and potential response. David's reaction was immediate and desperate. Instead of surrendering to the inevitable, he seemed to double down on his increasingly irrational justifications. "Officers, you need to understand what's really happening here. This man," he pointed accusingly at Lewis, "has been stealing money from our company and destroying the livelihoods of innocent employees. I came here to get evidence of his crimes, not to commit any crimes myself." Sergeant Hayes had heard countless variations of this same story throughout her career. Criminals who had convinced themselves that their victims deserved whatever they got, lawbreakers who genuinely believed that their actions were justified by some greater wrong that had been done to them. David's passionate conviction made him more dangerous, not less, because people who believe they are righteous are capable of extreme actions. Marcus seized the moment to provide the officers with crucial information. "Sergeant, I'm Marcus Chen, head of security for the Beaumont estate. I activated our lockdown protocol earlier this evening because Mr. Richardson arrived at the property in an agitated state and was making threats against Mr. Beaumont and his family. He returned with these 2 men and forced entry into the house." The professional clarity of Marcus's report helped Sergeant Hayes quickly assess the situation. A security guard with proper training and credentials, a homeowner defending his property, and 3 men who had forced entry into a private residence, the legal and tactical picture was clear, even if the personal dynamics were complicated. Lewis, still holding his weapon but keeping it pointed safely downward, addressed the officers directly. "Officers, David Richardson was my business partner until earlier today when I discovered financial irregularities in our company accounts. He became increasingly agitated throughout the day, and now he's brought these men to my home to intimidate me and my family." David's response was to become even more agitated. "Financial irregularities? Lewis, tell them the truth. Tell them how you've been skimming money from our construction projects for years. Tell them how you blamed me for your own theft." One of David's companions, the taller man with scarred hands, apparently decided that the situation had deteriorated beyond salvage. He began moving toward a side exit that led to an exterior staircase from the cellar. His movement was subtle but caught Marcus's attention immediately. "Officer Morrison," Marcus called out, "the tall suspect is moving toward the east exit. There's an outside staircase that leads directly to the rear garden." Officer Morrison immediately repositioned himself to block that escape route, while Sergeant Hayes maintained her focus on the main group. The tactical situation was becoming more complex as the suspects realized that their options for escape were being systematically eliminated. The shorter, more muscular man with tattoos seemed to be calculating his own chances of escape or resistance. Marcus could see him assessing the positions of the officers, the layout of the cellar, and the potential for using the wine racks as cover. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge, with multiple people in close proximity and at least one firearm in play. Lewis, perhaps recognizing that his continued possession of the pistol was complicating the officer's ability to resolve the situation safely, made a crucial decision. "Officers, I'm going to place my weapon on this wine barrel and step away from it. I have a concealed carry permit, and I was only armed because these men forced their way into my home." The gesture was both wise and courageous. By voluntarily disarming himself, Lewis removed one variable from an already complex tactical situation. Sergeant Hayes nodded approvingly and instructed Officer Morrison to secure the weapon once the immediate threat was contained. David watched Lewis disarm himself with obvious frustration. The symbolic act of surrendering the gun represented everything that David felt was wrong with his former partner: a willingness to submit to authority, to follow rules even when those rules might disadvantage him personally. In David's distorted worldview, Lewis's cooperation with the police was yet another example of his fundamental weakness. "You always were too eager to please authority figures," David said bitterly. "That's why you never understood what it took to build a real business. You wanted to follow every regulation, pay every tax, treat every employee like family. You never understood that sometimes you have to break a few rules to achieve something important." Sergeant Hayes recognized the psychological dynamics at play and decided to use them to her advantage. "Mr. Richardson, if you believe that Mr. Beaumont has committed crimes against your company, the proper place to address those allegations is in court, not in his wine cellar with armed companions. Why don't you tell me about these financial irregularities you mentioned?" The invitation to talk about his grievances was exactly what David needed to hear. He launched into a detailed explanation of his version of their business relationship, describing years of what he saw as unfair treatment, inadequate recognition, and eventual betrayal. As he spoke, his two companions began to realize that their employer was revealing more information than was strategically wise. Marcus watched the taller suspect's face as David continued his rambling justification. The man's expression showed growing concern and irritation with David's verbal indiscretions. Professional criminals understand the value of silence when confronted by law enforcement, and David's eagerness to explain his motivations was potentially damaging to all three of them. The shorter man apparently reached the same conclusion and decided to take matters into his own hands. He suddenly lunged toward the wine rack where Lewis had placed his pistol, clearly intending to grab the weapon and change the tactical balance of the confrontation. His movement was fast and determined, but Marcus had been anticipating exactly this kind of desperate action. Marcus intercepted the reaching man with a tackle that sent both of them crashing into a display of vintage champagne bottles. The sound of breaking glass and the impact of bodies hitting the stone floor created chaos in the confined space of the cellar. Officer Morrison immediately moved to assist Marcus in restraining the suspect, while Sergeant Hayes maintained her position covering David and the remaining accomplice. The physical altercation seemed to break David's remaining psychological restraint. Instead of surrendering to the inevitable, he made one final, desperate attempt to justify his actions and achieve some kind of victory over his former partner. "Lewis, this is your fault. All of it. If you had just listened to me, if you had just trusted me, none of this would have happened." Lewis, now weaponless and standing among the wreckage of several expensive bottles of wine, looked at his former friend with a mixture of pity and sadness. "David, I did trust you. For 20 years, I trusted you with my business, my reputation, and my family's financial security. The only thing I couldn't trust you with was my conscience." The statement seemed to drain the fight out of David completely. The rage that had sustained him throughout the evening suddenly collapsed, leaving behind only exhaustion and the bitter recognition of what he had destroyed. His remaining accomplice, seeing David surrender, raised his hands and submitted to arrest without further resistance. As the officers secured the suspects and called for additional units to process the scene, Marcus surveyed the damage to the wine cellar. Broken bottles created pools of expensive wine on the stone floor, mixing vintages that had been decades in the making. The sanctuary that Lewis had created over years of passionate collecting bore the scars of a friendship that had turned violent and destructive. Lewis stood amid the wreckage, no longer the confident businessman who had descended to his cellar earlier that evening to think through his problems in solitude. The events of the night had aged him visibly, but there was also a sense of resolution in his demeanor. The betrayal by his business partner was complete, but so was his understanding of what kind of man David had become. Sergeant Hayes began the process of taking statements from all parties involved. Marcus would need to explain his decision to activate the lockdown protocol and his choice to leave his secure position to join Lewis in the cellar. Lewis would need to describe the business disputes that had led to the confrontation and justify his decision to arm himself. David and his accomplices would be charged with breaking and entering, criminal intimidation, and potentially conspiracy, depending on what the investigation revealed about their planning and intentions. As the immediate crisis passed and the cellar was secured as a crime scene, Marcus reflected on the choices he had made throughout the evening. His decision to disobey orders and activate the lockdown had prevented what might have been a much more serious crime. His choice to leave his post and join Lewis in the cellar had put him in position to prevent the shorter suspect from seizing the weapon. The wine cellar door that had stood locked for those crucial hours had indeed protected Lewis, but not in the way anyone could have anticipated. Instead of simply providing physical security, the locked door had created a confined space where the truth about David's intentions and character could be fully revealed. The sanctuary had become a courtroom where years of hidden resentment and betrayal were finally exposed. Helena and Sarah were reunited with Lewis as the suspects were led away in handcuffs. The family embraced amid the broken glass and spilled wine, grateful to be alive and together despite the destruction of property and relationships that had seemed permanent just hours before. The wine collection could be rebuilt, but the friendship between Lewis and David was beyond repair. Marcus stood guard as the crime scene investigators began their work, documenting evidence that would be crucial in the prosecution of David and his accomplices. The decision to disobey orders had been vindicated by events, but Marcus knew that the night had changed him in ways that would take time to fully understand. The wine cellar door that had stood locked would be repaired, but the trust and innocence that had been shattered in those few hours could never be completely restored.